Hi and welcome back to the Academy of Historical Fencing and another video in this sword terminology series. So please do check out the playlist for this particular series because I'm going to work through sword terminology. We're going to do mostly 18th and 19th century stuff to begin with, but we are working back through and forward different periods and different terminology. So we're going to keep expanding it, more and more videos. But yeah, the initial focus has been, things like sabre, spadroon, broadsword, cutlass. And today we're going to get on to backsword. So the term backsword is one that actually was not actually hugely long-lived, but has actually played a large part in British and English culture in terms of sword typology and sword descriptions. So we're going to look at what it means, why they exist, and how the term can be used in different time periods and different circumstances. So simply put, a backsword is a sword with a single edge. So a backsword is completely thick and blunt on the back or the spine of the blade. So the back of the blade, you might call it the false edge, the short edge, the back edge. It has different terms to be used for it, but a backsword is completely blunt and usually quite thick on the back here. So it has no way to actually deal any kind of strike as far as a sword will be concerned. However, they can sometimes be sharp on the back of the last sort of few inches, maybe 10 to 12 centimeters near the tip. So theoretically, a backsword can deliver a back edge strike. So a back edge strike is a strike with the back of the blade. Theoretically, a backsword could deliver that if it happens to have a sharpened back edge there. And some do and some don't. So this one just doesn't. And plenty of them don't, some of them do. Anyway, that's it. So in simple terms, backsword is a single-edged sword. But it gets a little bit more complicated than that because the term backsword is only ever applied to straight blades. So if it has any curve whatsoever, it's no longer a backsword. If it's shorter than a kind of medium-length sword, it becomes a short sword. Even if it's straight, it's still not considered a backsword. So, for example, this is dead straight. It's made in a backsword fashion. It actually is almost sharp on that last few inches, like I was talking about, but not really. That's more to do with making it lighter and better for the thrust. But yeah, this is a backsword style blade, but because it's so short, it wouldn't really be considered a backsword. It would fall into the various short sword categories, hanger, cutlass, that kind of thing. And the same goes for the cutlass itself. So there's an 1804 Navy cutlass. It's a backsword blade as such, but because it's in the short sword category, we wouldn't normally call it a backsword. We would put it into short sword, cutlass, hanger, that kind of category. So yeah, if a sword is particularly short, it's not going to be a backsword. If it has any curve, it's not going to be a backsword. It has to be of a medium length or above and no sharp edge on the back until the last few inches. So yeah, in simple terms, that's what a backsword is. And in England, these really became popular. This kind of is the typical form of what you would normally call a backsword because you normally apply the term to a medium length blade that is straight, single-edged, and has a basket hilt. That's the most common time you'll see the term backsword being applied to any kind of sword. It's something like this, which really had its heyday in the late 16th, ranging up to about the late 17th century, and a little bit beyond, but that's typically when people consider the backsword to be the sort of the golden era of this kind of form. Now, why, basically? Because with European swords, certainly when they're straight, we're so used to seeing double-edged blades. So if you look at knightly swords, you look at Viking swords, look at long swords, they're all double-edged, almost always. And in that actually, Viking swords are an example where you will find single-edged examples. They are not as common, but you will find single-edged Viking swords, so essentially a backsword Viking sword. Yep, they do exist. But why would you have a single edge? Because, good old standard traditional, medieval European sword is typically like this. It's a symmetrical double-edged blade. And, part of it is to do, a large part of it is to do with what's going on down here at the guard. So when you have a sword that is symmetrical like this and can be used in either way, going like this, you can see why you'd want to have sharp edges on both sides because you can draw the sword and use it either way. Whereas once you've got a sword hilt that can only be used one way, having a sharp edge on the back is suddenly nowhere near as useful. And in fact, when you get a simple sword like this, and you can twist it around, that does obviously give an advantage in that you've got two sharp and good edges. So as you basically blunt or damage, more likely, one edge, you can actually shift it around. But it also means you can pick it up and use it either way, draw it either way. So there are some benefits to having two edges when you've got a hilt that can be used either way and just twisted around. Sorry for the rattle, it's one of my training swords. You can just twist it around and use it either way. And so once swords started getting hilts that could only allow them to be used one way, that secondary edge is just nowhere near as useful as it used to be. You know, how useful is it having a sharp edge sort of down here? Well, you might say it could help stopping people from grabbing your blade, you know, in terms of blade grabs, but ultimately it's still sharp on the front edge. So how useful is it having a sharp blade here? I would suggest not very. And so when you have this backsword style construction, what it allows you to do is have a quite light blade with excellent edge geometry, because let's say, for example, you wanted to make this exact blade as a double-edged blade right now. Well, to maintain its strength and rigidity, this spine on the back, what you'd have to do is move it to the middle to make it essentially a diamond section, cross-section. And you could do that, and you could match the equivalent weight to this sword. But to do it, that spine would then come into the middle, and then your edge geometry would obviously be completely changed, because you would have a much stronger taper from the spine to the edge, whereas these backsword blades, they have a really gentle taper from spine to the front of the blade where the edge is, and that means they cut incredibly well. So if you look at the way, for example, shamshears are normally made, they're just like that. They are a backsword style construction where they're thick on the back, really gentle taper to the edge, and that means they hold an incredible edge. So the backsword construction does allow you to have quite a light blade that maintains excellent edge geometry and cutting ability. And they usually are lighter than equivalent double-edged blades. They don't have to, because there are lots of ways to make a double-edged blade light. But as I said, it may compromise its edge geometry for doing so. The backsword construction is, of course, also easier to manufacture, because you're only having to put one edge on the sword. It's also therefore easier to maintain. There's less maintenance. So it's cheaper and easier to make, easier to maintain, and can, for its very light weight, maintain an incredibly good edge and edge geometry. And so you can see the reasons why you might want to go for a single-edged blade. So it's simple, it's light for what it is, excellent edge geometry, there you go. And yeah, once you've got a hilt that can only be held in one way, that secondary edge really isn't very useful anymore. And if you still want to do back edge strikes, you can absolutely sharpen that last few inches and use back edge strikes. Now, going back to curved blades and their relation to the backsword, and I did say that you can't call a curved blade a backsword, and that is because the backsword terminology is specifically applied to a single-edged straight blade. But the curious thing is that when British people, English people in the 16th and 17th century encountered curved blades in the Middle East, the Far East, stuff like that, in North Africa, like this. So this is a shamshear. They described them at the time in news publications and books as a crooked backsword, which is kind of interesting because the term sabre, although in other cultures, the term sable charbler had already existed, in English, the term sabre realistically didn't come in until about the mid-18th century. And actually curved swords did exist by that time in Britain, but they were mostly shorter blades, so hangers and cutlasses and that kind of thing, so they fell into that hanger and cutlass category. There weren't really many at all long curved blades. They were a real rarity in Britain until the mid-18th century. And so when Brits encountered these blades, yes, they called them a crooked backsword, and sometimes a bit later they'd call them something like a half crescent or half moon backsword, and then it became half moon or half crescent sabre because it's so much more extreme than most European sabres. So you can see how they might describe it, and it makes perfect sense, because this shamshear blade, if it was straight, it would exactly be a backsword. So yeah, it's a backsword made curved. And therefore, could you say a backsword is a straight sabre? Theoretically, yes, you could, but in British English, a sabre has to be curved. So it doesn't really work. But if you want to think in those terms, yes. And actually, if you compare some sort of backswords around 1600, in terms of weight and handling characteristics, they can be really similar to 19th century sabres, even though they look just a little bit different. But ultimately, they're both single-edged blades of roughly the same length and mass. So yeah, you can think of a backsword as a straight sabre, or a sabre as a curved backsword if you want to, but please don't use that terminology because it'll just be confusing. But yeah, they did refer to these basically foreign blades as a crooked backsword. And English sources at the time, they would call this sword a scimitar usually, sometimes a shamshir, which is a bit more accurate, but scimitar became the prevalent term within Britain, and it's still used today. And it's at times not a very helpful term because it basically just means an exotic or foreign sabre, so something from North Africa, Middle East, Far East, things like tulwars, pulwars, shamshirs, kilich. And we'll actually look more at the scimitar term because it is an interesting one, because it's essentially a British term for foreign blades. We'll look at that in another video. So yes, crooked backsword is what you would apply to this. So yeah, don't use backsword for a curved blade. Now, there are some other straight single-edged blades that were in use when the backswords were and well after. So two examples would be the spadroon and some of the heavy cavalry swords that we would sometimes call palash or broadsword. I'll go into that in a little minute. And how does that fit into the backsword category? Well, ultimately the term backsword was phasing out. It was falling out of usage at quite a rapid rate in the mid-18th century when the term spadroon rose to prevalence. Now, before the term spadroon was used, the common term was shearing sword, spelled two different ways with the EA or double E. And the shearing sword is described as a light double-edged blade, so basically a light backsword, whereas the spadroon is more commonly like this, single-edged, exactly as a backsword would be. And that's why the terminology changed, because you can get spadroons that are single-edged and you can get spadroons that are double-edged. So it's a little bit confusing, and the spadroon term rose to prevalence. We first see it in MacBain in 1728, and he says that shearing sword and spadroon are the same thing, and that makes a whole lot of sense. So you just drop the term shearing sword and you drop the term backsword, and then those swords basically filter into the correct category, so that if you have a very heavy backsworded blade, you would put it into the broadsword category, and if you had a lighter backsword blade, you'd put it into the spadroon category. Now, in terms of language use today, some people are still very attached to the backsword term, particularly if they work from things like George Silver and from some 17th century and very early 18th century manuals. So some people are still very attached to backsword, and I can understand that, and I wouldn't say stop using it, but it's just interesting to look at the historical perspective of how these swords fit into the different categories and how you might want to use them. And certainly if you are working from late 18th century and 19th century manuals, it's well worth at that point just dropping the backsword term altogether, because as I said, it did filter in to broadsword and spadroon, because that makes a whole lot more sense. Once you've got a sword that can only be held one way, how many edges it has is really not important. It is important if you've got a sharpened back edge on the last few inches, because that determines whether you can use the back edge. But whether it's blunt or sharp on the rest of the back edge is really not relevant to the way that the sword is used. And so the spadroon, like this, you could legitimately call this a backsword, in fact. That will also annoy the backsworders. And a well-made spadroon is a very good backsword. Like this one, for example, this is a sergeant's or NCO's spadroon of the Napoleonic period, and it has as much mass and rigidity as many good backswords of around 1600. So yeah, you could legitimately call this a backsword, but it'd be better to save from confusion and just use the spadroon terminology. Now, going on to the heavy cav that I just showed. So the heavy cavalry sword, through and through, is a backsword. It's a big, heavy, single-edged sword. Although on that note, if you look at William Hope, he generally assumed that a backsword was a light and agile cut and thruster. He put them in the same category as the shearing sword, which, remember, that's a spadroon. So Hope considered a backsword to be basically the single-edged version of the shearing sword. And so this is a heavy backsword. And remember, going back to the terminology of where would we fit a heavy backsword in this period, we put it in the broadsword category, because broadsword, by definition, is a blade of medium to long length that is focused as a heavy cutter. Can thrust, but it's a heavy cutting sword. So you would put this in as a broadsword. Now it'll also be called a palash, which is another video we're going to have to cover, because this was a almost exact copy of an Austrian cavalry sword, and they called it a palash. Now that word and the various versions of it that were used throughout European languages never existed in British English until more recently, when collectors have started applying the term in retrospect. But it is a palash, it just wasn't a palash in English. So this one you would call a broadsword at its time, and you could potentially call it a backsword if you want. But in the late 18th century, that would be a little bit confusing. So, in roundup, the backsword. Usually, a backsword is a blade length of something like 30 to about 38 inch. Okay, that's about the rough sort of extreme spectrum. Has to be straight, has to have only one edge and potentially a short, sharp edge on the back near the tip, and that's it. They can be fullered, they can be non-fullered, they can have multiple fullers. So you'll find variety, but what you will usually find with backswords is they tend to be quite thin in its profile, and they tend to be quite agile in comparison to their broadsword equivalents. And the other thing to consider is that over time, people thought of the backsword more as the English sword and the broadsword as the Scottish sword. And that's understandable, because that's kind of the way it went, is that with particularly English cavalry swords, they tended to steer towards single-edged blades, whereas the Scots held on to the double-edged blade. And you might ask, if you've got a hilt like this that has a basket hilt, why would you have double edges when I've already said it doesn't really serve any purpose to have this edge sharp? Well, at that point, I would say never underestimate the importance of fashion and cultural traditions on the design and look of swords. So just like the fact that why does a small sword still have rings or anelets that your fingers could potentially go through when you don't actually use them? They're not used in small sword. Well, because the rapier before them had it. It's a tradition thing, it's a fashion thing. And for me, I fully think that most basket-hilted swords and similar, swords that could only be used one way, why did they maintain a symmetrical double-edged blade? I think it's entirely fashion. And when you look to the Scots, they were all about this kind of Highland militaristic fashion and culture, which was designed to hark back to their old ways. And I think that broad double-edged blade allowed them to do that. And that being said, the Scots did also use lots of single-edged blades, especially the ones that were made in large quantities in England for the Scottish regiments. So the ones that were made in Birmingham and London, so Drury, for example, they were made in their thousands with Scottish basket-hilted swords, but they were backswords, single-edged. And that one you could legitimately call a backsword or a broadsword, because it would have absolutely been called both. Anyway, there you have it. The backsword, they can usually be a very nimble and agile sword. They often have a really good bit of hand protection, and they can be a really, really nice sword to also test cut with. So I do hope you've enjoyed the video. I will continue on the series and cover all kinds of other sword terminology in the future. Please do subscribe if you haven't already.